Good afternoon. My name is Taija Griffin. I'm a candidate for APR+M, and today I'll be presenting my reimagined communication plan on Obagami Express 23, which occurred from January 23rd to February 3rd of this year in Lagos, Nigeria. So a little bit of background on my exercise if you're unfamiliar with Omagami. Omagami, or Bangame as it's pronounced in its origin language of African Fang, means togetherness. It's the largest annual maritime exercise in Western and Central Africa. It is hosted by NAVAF and US 6th Fleet. This is our 12th iteration that we hosted the exercise, and we saw more than 30 participating nations. As I mentioned earlier, it was hosted in Lagos, Nigeria, but we did have multiple training sites throughout the Gulf of Guinea. And then just a little bit of background on Nigeria, our host nation. They do maintain the largest navy in the Gulf of Guinea and a very large and robust free and independent press, arguably one of the most influential press corps on the continent. So before I get into the RPI process, I wanted to quickly set the scene for you all because there are quite a few geopolitical events that took place that really shaped the way I approached my communication plan. And the first was that in the beginning of the year, we really saw a very clear redirection of messaging and diplomatic interests by Russia, and what we perceived to be a disinformation campaign, seeking to sow, a sense of mistrust against the U.S. And then on our side, we observed our leaders, namely Secretary Blinken here, actually taking a very active role, not only countering a lot of those accusations, but very clearly laying out our vision and our priorities for how we were going to show up in the region. And so, as we got closer to exercise execution, this exercise really did seem like it was going to be the perfect opportunity for us to kind of continue to build off of some of that momentum that Secretary Blinken had started and to really reassert our commitment as a maritime force and as long-term partners in the region. So for research, the first phase of the RPI process, I did my primary formal research in two phases. The first phase was done prior to the exercise, and then the second phase was done in preparation for APR+M, which gave me the opportunity to kind of go back and reapply or apply some of the techniques and methods I had learned since execution. And so for this first phase, that pre-exercise research, I did primary formal research through media analysis where I examined 1,200 media articles. Three findings that I wanted to quickly point out for you all. Nigeria, South Africa, and Morocco made up the largest share of voice in coverage. Portugal and Spain consistently provided very accurate and favorable coverage of our equities in the region. And that was particularly important because when you go back to what Secretary Blinken was saying about how we were going to show up, it was going to be alongside some of our allies and partners. And so being able to identify non-US outlets that were going to be able to help kind of carry some of that water for us was going to be particularly very important. And then the third finding that I wanted to point out was just the importance of wire services and how critical they are into disseminating our message. It's relatively easy to kind of get your message out to a country like Nigeria that has a very large press corps, but then how do you reach some of these smaller countries in the Gulf of Guinea like Benin and Togo? It's going to be through wire services. In the media analysis, I also did an environmental scan of social media and found some varying levels of usage, which kind of points me to some of the limitations and knowledge gaps that this pointed out. Two being the first was that we had a lack of understanding really on how our partners were consuming media. So what was their preferred channel? How did they like to receive the media? We weren't really quite sure on that. And then the second was that we weren't really sure how our adversaries were communicating with them. Are they using, untraditional means like WhatsApp or radio to communicate with them? That was an initial gap for us. Okay, so for the second phase of formal, primary research was a content analysis, which I did in preparation for APR+M. I found some similarities and then some new findings that we didn't know initially. First was that Nigeria, Spain, and South Africa made up the largest share of voice. That was something that was consistent with the information that we already knew. But something that was new was that NAVAF and AFRICOM's dominant coalition only made up 2% of U.S. quotes. And so that was particularly problematic because this is our exercise and we only make up 2% of coverage. And so when you think about, hey, there's an ongoing disinformation campaign, you have a limited share of voice, you really start to look at this holistically to understand the pieces of the puzzle are kind of coming together and we have a potential problem. And we'll get into that a little bit more during the presentation. Okay, and so for secondary research, I did my secondary, informal research kind of in two categories. The first was through open source, and then the second was, information that I gained through my relationship and my network with the State Department. And so for open source, I was looking at anything that I can get my hands on in terms of like speeches, fact sheets, press releases, anything that the State Department or the White House was putting out that was characterizing how we were going to show up in the region, what the problems were, and what the solution was going to be. Another thing that I started to look at, but I didn't initially know, was white papers and academic research. To be quite frank, I didn't know really anything about this or to even, look in this area. But after, kind of learning the things that I did during the APR+M process, I found that, the African Media Barometer and the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism actually produces really fantastic, very detailed reports on African media consumption, and then more specifically, Nigeria media consumption. And so that actually helped fill that initial gap that we had during that media analysis. And then for the State Department, the information that I gained through them, they were instrumental in helping myself and my team really understand the media landscape and some cultural sensitivities that we would need to be aware of when we're communicating with this public, and as well as kind of more nuanced problems in Nigeria. So, namely the election posture. When we're going to start the exercise, we're about 2 weeks out, I think, from their presidential elections. And so we were able to kind of go into it with our eyes open and know that we're going to really have to compete for media attention because they're going to be focused on polling and predictive outcomes, kind of as any country would be, going into a presidential election. Okay, so for a SWOT analysis, I didn't initially do this during my communication plan, but I was able to kind of go back and kind of think a little bit more critically about some of these factors here. Um, I did include a full SWOT analysis in my appendix should you want to kind of look through those details a little bit more closely. But for the purposes of this presentation, I just wanted to pull out the top ones in each category here. So strengths and weaknesses are internal to our organization, and then opportunities and threats are external factors. So for our key strength here, we've got a strong track record and presence in the region. This is really important when you have accusations against you, coming from leading competitors. We can kind of rely on that goodwill and our name and our reputation to really speak for us. For weaknesses, we've got some resource and organizational restraints that limit how we show up and how we compete. When we look at some of our competitors. So, for example, when you look at Russia and China, they can kind of offer these deals that, because we have budgetary and legal restraints, we can't do. For example, during the exercise, the president of Nigeria announced that China was going to be building and funding a deep water port in the same city, right? We can't do that. We can't offer those types of deals. An opportunity that we do have is that we do have access to a global network of allies and partners with equities in the region. So when the French, when the Danes, when the Brits are down in the region, we can go with them. We can extend our line of operations and continue to show up as long-term partners. And then threats, geopolitical competition for partnership is really only increasing, and we know that is going to be the key threat there. Okay, and so for a problem statement, when you think about the disinformation that's going on in the region, when you understand that we have limited share of voice in the region, you really start to understand what the key problem is. And so my key problem that I came up with was that 95% of Nigerians consume news through digital sources, despite disinformation being a widespread issue in the region. And last year, US leaders contributed to only 2% of exercise related coverage. And so, considering all of this, we perceive that there is a lack of awareness on the US commitment within the region. Okay, and so to address this problem, my goal was really just to improve the awareness of the U.S. commitment in the region. My strategy was to use media engagement. More specifically, I was looking at digital and traditional media to highlight how we were connecting with our partner nations and their leaders. And then for my objectives, I had two objectives. Two informational impact objectives. The first was to increase regional mentions of U.S. efforts during the exercise by 50%. And then the second was to earn at least 3 featured articles on U.S. efforts during the exercise and prominent ally media outlets. So when you kind of go back to what's the key problem, it's a lack of awareness. This is how you're going to be able to address it. You need people to know what you're doing. You've got to increase your mentions, and you've got to get that third-party validation to kind of substantiate and validate what you're doing. Okay, so for theory, I didn't actually include theory in my initial communication plan. To be honest, I didn't know a lot about theory prior to this process. But when I went back to examine, what I did and what was my approach, I found that relational theory best fit what I achieved. Relational theory is a subset of OPR theory. It focuses on balancing the interests of organizations and publics through the management of OPR. Um, it's deeply interconnected with the two-way communication model in that, I'm the sender, so I send you a message and you receive it and you get to send one back to me. And when I get that feedback, I'm actually able to adjust my tactics and my approach to better fit your needs. So it's interactive, it's dynamic, in its foundation. Another thing that relational theory really hits on is that kind of connection to the African diaspora. That was something that was a key point of messaging from Secretary Blinken and President Biden. And so that was something that I was going to continue to build off of, and we'll get into that a little bit later when we get to the implementation phase of the RPI process. Okay, so for target publics, I did initially have my target publics identified, but I didn't do a stakeholder analysis. And so this process actually gave me the opportunity to kind of think a little bit more critically about why I chose these people in my publics. So for my primary public, I chose African military leaders. This is an active group, so they're aware of the issues and they're actively doing something about it. On the X and Y axis, power versus interest, they're high on both. Law enforcement is also a primary public that I chose. They're an aware group, so aware of the issues, but not necessarily sure how they can do anything about it. High on power, medium level on interest there. And then community leaders. This is my third primary group that I chose. They're a latent group, so not really sure how any of these problems really affect them. However, they do have a medium level of power and then low interest level. And I'll get into a little bit more on why I chose them as a primary group. And then for my secondary public, I chose non-African allies and partners. This is an active group, high on both the X and Y axis. And then my tertiary public was geopolitical competitors. This is an active group, high on both the X and Y axis. Okay, getting to the second pillar of the RPI process, which is planning. I wanted to just pull out 4 key considerations that I did during the planning process. The first was guidance. I wrote PAG and shared that and disseminated that throughout my staff as well as throughout all of the participating embassies and up the chain until it was approved through OSD for approval. I also wrote an annex, which allowed me to kind of include a little bit more information that didn't really fit within the confines of a PAG, but was really necessary to sharing information and kind of coordinating how partner nations could route imagery for release. Staffing was my next consideration. Initially, I sought out to, get a team that was comparable to last year. So I think they had a team of about 8, and that's what I was shooting for. I sent a request for support through NPACE as well as my reserve unit. And initially I got the numbers and I was really, really happy about that. And then when I started to work through some of those administrative processes for getting country clearance, I really ran into quite a few issues. Namely, Nigeria requires no fee official passports as well as visas. That can take anywhere from 60 to 90 days, depending on which embassy you're going through to get that clearance. And so what that did was it actually left me with only 2 MCs that were going to be able to meet the administrative timeline in time for execution. And so being that I had such a small staff, I knew that content, which is the next consideration that I had for planning, was going to be really important. I front loaded everything that I could before exercise execution. So press releases, image, graphics, anything and everything that we could have front loaded, we did. I didn't want to mess around with trying to write kickoff press releases when I could be focusing on getting compelling imagery or telling really dynamic stories of things that were happening on the ground. And then the last consideration was really through the budget. I ran into quite a few budgetary issues because I had a small staff. I couldn't just allow an MC to go out on a bus and stay at a site all day. I needed to be able to hit multiple sites throughout the day so that we can cover as much of the exercise as possible. And so when I initially requested transportation for PA through my staff. There were some, legal justifications that kind of prevented me from being able to achieve that. And so then my next step in the planning process for budget was then I worked with the State Department. I asked to be added to their motor pool list, and they graciously allowed that to happen. And so my team and I were able to call for motor pools to kind of ping pong between different sites throughout the days. And then when that was, unavailable due to a busy schedule at the motor pool on any given day. I reached out to some of the sister services that were participating, so Coast Guard, Army. Hey, I see that you're going to this event. Do you have room on your boat? Do you have, an extra seat on your bus to allow myself or my MC, to attend? And so that's kind of how we got around some of those budgetary issues. Okay, so for implementation, the third pillar of the RPI process, kind of going back to that relational theory, I really wanted to focus on the diaspora and our connection that we have that our competitors, quite frankly, do not have. And so one way that I did that was I created a Humans of New York style feature series. So we did a lot of, first person candid stories, and a lot of times of, African born sailors that were returning to their birth countries to support Obagami Express. Another thing that we did was we really focused on interagency and joint service collaboration. We wanted folks to know that the U.S. was committed to solving some of these transnational issues that are going on, and that we were working with interagencies and international partners to do so. So really focusing on Interpol and our connection with them and INL on how we were stopping some of these maritime crimes. Another aspect was the soft power diplomacy of the band. I really capitalized on that. Their ability to deliver key messaging, resonates so much more authentically than, anything that I could put in a press release or on a social media post. Um, Kind of going back to that problem statement, knowing that we had a low awareness of coverage there, and that we only had 2% last year of coverage. I knew that including media was going to be key to reaching our objectives, and so I inserted media anywhere I could. I also worked with the State Department to do a continent-wide digital press briefing where we invited, defense reporters throughout the continent to dial in and to cover the exercise. And so those were some of the key things that we did to kind of help boost the mentions and the awareness of the exercise. And then kind of going back to that secondary informal information that I gained through the State Department, we knew that the information landscape was a little bit different, a little bit more competitive. And we knew that, previously, the State Department said, hey, you'll send an O5 to meet with their 3-star. That type of interactions really isn't going to fly anymore. It's a little bit more competitive. And so what we did was we stepped up our flag participation. I think last year, I don't think we had any flags come down to cover the exercise. And this year, between NAVAF and AFRICOM, we actually had 5 flag officers come down, do office calls, and engage in some dialogue with our key leaders down in the region. Okay, so for evaluation, the last phase of the RPI process, did I meet my objectives? Did not meet objective 1, did meet objective 2, which was, kind of getting those 3 featured articles. Why didn't I meet objective 1? I sought out to get 50%. I think initially, I think I actually got 30% when we looked at the data. I think there were quite a few reasons. One, I had a small staff, right? I only had two MCs. There's only so much we could do. There's only so many places we could actually be to cover events. So that, I think that contributed. But I think also the information environment was just very different. It was more competitive. There were more things going on that were distracting and taking away from our share of voice. One example of that is South Africa, which is a major leader in the region and on the continent, announced that they were not going to participate in our exercise, which they normally do, but instead they were going to be actually participating with Russia and China doing a maritime exercise the following week, right? So those are things that we can't plan for, but certainly, kind of change the way that we can get our message out. Okay, so for some insights, in addition to my evaluation, I actually had AFRICOM and the State Department do their own evaluations. And so between the three media assessments, I wanted to kind of consolidate some of the key findings for you all. First was that coverage was neutral, it was positive, it was objective, it was really everything that you want coverage to be for your exercise. Nigeria and South Africa made up the largest share of Anglophone coverage. However, Francophone was a close second. And so had I known that, I would have put way more detail and attention into doing French products. I think I actually only did one fully French product, so I would have done a little bit more there. Another thing that I thought was interesting was that women leadership were top performing posts on social media, but did really poorly in traditional media. So I think there's something there we need to think about. What did we do right on social media that didn't translate as well in print? And then I want to remind you all that I included community leaders as a primary public, even though they were a latent audience. The band's visit to the Nikkei Art Gallery, which is the largest art gallery in Africa, drove a 42 article peak in circulated coverage. And so this was the largest covered article that we had on our exercise, hands down. And I think it's exactly, if you think about, if you can activate these audiences, they will do the work for you. We were able to kind of tell the story where we put them as the center, community leaders as the center of the focus. And instead of telling a story of the band visits this art gallery, what we said was, this community leader, one that everyone knows and loves and respects, this community leader has welcomed the Navy band in for this musical, cultural collaboration, right? When you tell it like that, when you activate the public, this public in that way, I think you see why the numbers are so drastic, and why they were the most circulated story in all of our coverage there. Last thing that I wanted to really highlight for you all was the importance of effective messaging through the flag leadership. When you get them involved, we see comprehensive coverage. So that's something that we need to continue to push toward. And then the last step in this RPI process here is when you a little bit more reflective, when you think about like an after action report, right? If I could give some recommendations, some tips to myself, if I were going to do this again, or to the next person going forward, these are the things that I would say. One, expect attempts to weaken U.S. And African partnerships. You have to expect it. That Mosey exercise, that South Africa, China, Russia exercise was a prominent topic during the digital press briefing, and we weren't quite prepared for the level of attention and interest that this exercise really garnered from defense reporters throughout the continent. Next thing I would say is leverage the band's ability to build those relationships. They can carry messages, strategic messages, more importantly, in a way that our press releases and our social media products cannot do. And then the third thing is just the importance of third-party validation and wire services. We need other folks to be carrying that water and telling people what we're doing. We cannot put, key messaging in a US press release and think it's going to reach folks in Africa. You have to have African reporters, African journalists telling African people about these issues. So third-party validation is just critical in that regard. Okay, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your time.